We should talk about the fact that, amongst many other things, you've been uh philosophically and spiritually battling monopolies in general. Sort of one of which is sort of the Apple marketplace that charges 30% from developers. Can you speak uh about this idea that you believe that Apple and other companies, Valve, should not be charging that kind of revenue cut?
Sure. Well, let's start from a very basic principle of computing. The first computer I owned was an Apple II Plus, designed by Steve Wozniak and marketed by Apple, and then an IBM PC. And in those days, anybody could write code. Your computer literally turned on with a programming language prompt in front of you. You had to actually do work to not write a program and to instead run somebody else's program. That was incredibly empowering. And anybody could write a program, anybody could put it on a floppy disk, anybody could share it with their friends. Anybody could make copies of that, put it in a store. They could sell it. They could build a business around it. And they were completely able to, without seeking any big tech corporation's permission, do whatever they want, even from IBM. Remember, IBM was the dominant computer company on earth at the time that they released IBM PC as an open platform. And so it's really been firmly implanted in my mind that this was a magical and wonderful time of unmatched economic progress for technology in the entire world. And over time, the big companies have realized that they could shut down and just block software makers from releasing software on their own and block software makers from doing business with customers directly. And yeah, I've always viewed this practice as terribly abusive because when you buy a computer, you spend or a phone, you spend good money on it. It's your money you spent on that phone, and now you own that phone. And there's absolutely no reason that Apple should block you from installing apps from other developers directly if you want, going to their webpage or writing your own apps without their permission and running them yourself without having to get a developer account, without having to go through their bureaucracy. And there's no reason that any consumer who gets an app shouldn't be able to do business directly with the developer of the consumer. You already bought that phone. Well, why should Apple be adding a 30% junk fee to all commerce you do? And why do they selectively apply it to some things and not others? I've always viewed this as deeply abusive, and that it shuts down the competitive engine that once fueled the app and software economy. It's still a vibrant competitive engine on Windows and on the internet, but it's no longer with mobile apps because these stores have popped up and they don't provide any useful value to the user. Yes, they're a search function to find software, but there's no reason other companies couldn't build a better one. And I bet if you had Steam or if you had Valve build Steam for iPhone, I bet Steam for iPhone would be a much better app store than the iOS app store, and a lot of people would use it. And that Apple would be forced to build a better app store in competition, and that everybody would improve their products as a result. But Apple and Google shutting down the competitive engine that drives the software economy has massive implications for everything. And one of them is reshaping the nature of mobile apps to be really offensive to gamer sensibilities. If you go on console,
Hmm.
the best console games you see listed in the store on the storefronts, the best console games that you see reviewed are awesome games that really have a lot of creative merit. The ones that sell the best are really enormous values for their money, and are the product of an immense amount of work. You don't see that on iPhone. The top apps on iPhone, the top games on iPhone at almost all times are these ridiculously greedy, high monetizing, whale games, which are pervaded with pay to win and loot box practices. They have a sort of a legalized a form of gambling, and these games are not driven by fun. They're driven by manipulation of the players to greedy ends. Um,
Yeah.
and it's very hard for the fun-based games to actually succeed there. And the costs of operating these online games now are enormously high. So you have a game that's based on fun, it's not loot box heavy. You have to pay 30% of your revenue to Apple in order to just get access to the platform. And 30% is way, way, way more than most game companies make in profits right now.
Mhm.
And so if that fee is more than the profit from a natural company, then they can only stay in business by raising prices. So these 30% fees are raising prices of all digital goods. It's just inflationary as a force in the economy. Um, that's just the first direct tax. But then to reach users, when a user searches for like before Apple blocked Fortnite on iOS, when a user searched for Fortnite, the first result was always some competing game. Like that's utterly anti-user. Like you search for Steam for a game, and if that game's on Steam, it's the first result always because Steam's not getting enshittified with advertising. Apple is, and they do that so they can make even more than 30%. So if you want to be the first search result for your game, you're probably paying more, like 45%. If you want to reach users on social media, you're paying another 20%. So literally something like 70% of the revenue for your game is just going into junk fees to acquire users and get them in your game. And the money that's left over is only enough to fund these, games with rather abusive practices that do not look to normal gamers like games for the most part. Now, there are some exceptions. There are some great games on iOS, and there are some games with good practices. But the engine has been really corrupted in a way that competition would fix. If you unleashed lots of competing stores on iOS, then you'd have lots of awesome options, and you'd have much better deals and much better prices.
I had a quick chat with Matthew. He asked me to ask you this question of why don't more companies fight Apple in the way openly and totally as Epic has been? What makes Epic so unique in this regard? And I should say, I think everything you said, I agree with fully. I think what Apple is doing is just wrong. I think Apple, in many dimensions, is an incredible company. They have brought so much good for the world. In this regard, I just think it's straight up wrong what they're doing. They're not providing the value of 30%. And even if they were, the monopolization, the centralized control without competition is wrong. Anyway, why are you fearlessly fighting Apple on this and other companies don't seem to want to step up?
All companies are terrified of Apple because Apple can destroy their business. Um, Epic was in a unique position with Fortnite. First of all, having the biggest game in the world at the time we started the fight with Apple. And second of all, having a majority of our users playing on PC and console meant that if we lost access to iOS during a fight, then we would still be able to survive. That set Epic apart. Uh, Spotify, Facebook, you name the top 10 mobile apps, I think none of them would be able to survive without Apple. Like, literally, their business would be destroyed if Apple blocked access to them. And Apple is incredibly clear with developers that they're willing to deprive all users of access to any app if they get in a fight. Um, and if you look at how they dealt with Epic, they were not just legally maneuvering with the intent of winning the court case against us. They were also sending a message to all developers in the world: we will destroy your business, or we will try our best if you fight us. And a very small number of vocal developers have been willing to speak up, and Apple has actually refrained from crushing their businesses when they weren't violating any Apple policies. And that took a bit of discipline, which I think is also amount of calculation by Apple that they couldn't survive being seen as the company killer. That if you criticize us, we'll crush your company. But the other thing Apple has that they can and will readily deploy against every developer is soft power. When they take 30% and advertising is so expensive, soft power by Apple, like approving your updates faster or slowing down all of your updates by a couple of weeks, can also have a dramatic effect on your ability to compete successfully. And Apple has a very long history of playing cat and mouse games with developers. It's like a developer uh, isn't in Apple's good graces, so just slow down the updates. So they've been slowing down updates for several major tech companies, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, without all going under the radar because everybody's afraid to challenge them publicly. Um, and so Apple's wielding a soft power can change a company's economics for the worse enough to deter almost any public company. And Epic is in the fight because I firmly believe that something like the metaverse will only arise. It's something like a billion plus user real-time 3D social ecosystem that it grows to encompass potentially all or most major games by all major developers tied together into an open economy where they all participate as peers and they all compete to give users the best deals. And they grow and do business with their customers directly. That thing can only exist if the Apple and Google gatekeeping monopolies are lifted. And it's not just the 30% fees. The 30% fees are economically ruinous, but they impose other levels of control. Apple prevents all web browsers on iOS from implementing web standards better than Apple does. So Apple has really limited data storage capabilities and 3D graphics capabilities on the iOS web APIs. So APIs you can access from web apps running within a web browser. And that's to intentionally cripple those apps to ensure that they can't possibly compete uh, with native apps. And by depriving web apps of those features, they prevent web apps from competing with native apps. Well, Apple, if they treat the metaverse the way they treat the web, they'll say you can only use Apple's metaverse engine. Unreal Engine is disallowed. And then they can impose all of their own limitations on the metaverse to force all commerce through Apple or force it to be so uncompetitive and lousy that it can't compete. And, they have this giant array of these anti-competitive techniques that they use to disadvantage other app developers. Um, saying only Apple can build certain kinds of apps or only Apple can integrate certain features. In Europe, even where the DMA law requires Apple to allow competing stores, they say a store can only be a store. You can't build a store into Facebook. You can't build a social network into a store. A store must only be a store because a store that's more than a store might be able to compete with us more effectively. It's just a giant, to use the Soviet term, it's a defense in depth strategy where they've constructed a massive series of barriers. Each are fatal to any attempt to compete, so that even if one barrier is overcome, the others remain in place and shut down the whole scheme. And that's playing out in Europe, where Apple has enabled us to launch the Epic Games Store, but has made it so difficult and uncompetitive both for Epic and for clients who we want to do business with that it has no chance of success until the European Union starts to really enforce the DMA law and impose harsh and serious penalties on Apple to force compliance.
I think it should be said, once again, I think it's wrong what they're doing there, and I hope there's public pressure and government pressure for them to open up the platform. And I believe, as a person who loves Apple, I believe this is also good for Apple. There's the natural thing in companies to want to close and control and crush competition. But like Apple is full of brilliant engineers. Open it up and win. It's going to create the right kind of competitive incentive to make the Apple Store better, to make, because they're great at creating great interfaces, but competition will sharpen the sword. I mean, it's just going to make everything much better. So I do hope there's a lot of public pressure, and I deeply appreciate that you're speaking out in this way, sort of putting that pressure and letting people know, like, it's okay to say that this is wrong.
Thanks. Yeah, competition makes everybody better. You have a monopoly that's forced to compete. Suddenly, the monopoly's products get much better. The offerings to consumers get much better. You see so many areas where Apple could be the best, but what they have is just really, really lousy, and it's this old guard of leadership who is clinging to these old policies, turning themselves into the enemy of every developer, every regulator, and I think it's ultimately massively to their detriment, and I can't wait for a new generation to come in and, paint a bright path to the future. Epic was an awesome partner to Apple, for more than a decade of demos and partnership and technology usage together, and we did amazing things together. I'd love nothing more than to have that Apple, uh, bringing back Steve Wozniak's original views. Just the Apple II is such an amazing thing. It's a completely open platform.
Mm-hmm.
The manual to the Apple II included a listing for all of the ROMs, the source code to the ROMs, so you could understand exactly what was happening there and you could learn from it. It included a hardware schematic of the entire computer, so you could learn how to make a peripheral and plug it in an open ecosystem. And that's the awesome Apple. That company would be the best company in the world again. I think the current one is just on the wrong side of history and needs to change.
Well, I hope Epic and Apple find a path forward together and flourishing together, and Apple embraces competition better.